Massacres in Syria, Israel attacking, displacements and broken ceasefires. What the hell is going on in Syria? In this video, we're going to talk about what happened after each other, the timeline. We'll talk about who was involved, and we'll talk about the backgrounds. On the 11th of July, it all started with an attack on a Druze vegetable trader with Bedouins. Bedouins attacked him, stole him his car and his property. He was mistreated, he was insulted because of his religion, he was threatened with being killed, and later he was being released heavily injured. The day later, armed men from the Druze community were taking hostages out of the Bedouin communities to this way get back the property of the trader. Bedouins in return took Druze hostages to make even on the hostages that the Druze had taken, and all of this had increased in its severity until the point where open hostility started and open battles began. That was on the 13th, and on the 14th, that was on the 12th, and on the 13th it escalated further. The violence was getting bigger, and now heavy weapons were getting involved. Reinforcements for the Bedouins were also arriving, and the government was sending troops to stop the fighting between the two groups. This, on the other hand, these government troops that were being sent were then attacked by armed personnel. On the 14th, according to reports, the government forces had supported at that point. Now they were starting to support local fighters, likely from the Bedouins, against the Druze. Videos are showing evidence that there have been mistreatment and violence against Druze, including brutal murders. So while the government forces initially came down to stop the fighting between the Bedouins and the Druze, at this point they were actively involved in fighting the Druze, besides the Bedouins, helping basically the Bedouins. After that, the Minister of Defense gave the order to stop all mistreatment, to stop all illegal activities that were happening by the government forces, but there were also government forces being killed by Druze fighters. Among them were prisoners that were taken and then executed by Druze fighters. Israel then started attacking the government forces to protect the Druze. On the 15th, the parts of the Druze community, Christians and other local leaders in Suvaida, had agreed with the government for a ceasefire and a security agreement, but Hikmat al-Hishri, one of the main protagonists, was refusing this ceasefire and this cooperation, which led to additional fighting afterwards. After Israeli airstrikes against the governmental forces, they were retreating, and Israeli Druze, so Israeli citizens of the Druze faith, had broken through the border between Israel and Syria to enter Syria to help their brothers in faith. The security at that point was officially handed over to local Druze militia, with the government withdrawing, and in that context it also became known that a church was set alight, by whom is unclear, even though obviously the expectation is that it was set alight by Bedouins or by the government forces. On the 16th then, additional Israeli airstrikes were happening, including against Damascus and the Ministry of Defense. Hikmat al-Hishri was asking Trump, Netanyahu, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, as well as Jordan's king, to protect the Druze. He said the Druze can no longer live under a regime that only knows governing through iron and fire. The agreement that was then made between the Druze religious leader and Damascus about reintegration, a truth commission to find out who was at fault, was then published. According to this, the Syrian forces were withdrawing from Suvaida. So supposedly al-Hishri had supported all of this, but the fighting continued, as he then claimed that there is no agreement with the government, and his forces continued attacking, and they continued attacking government forces. On the 17th of July, the Suvaida Military Council had begun attacks against the Bedouins. That Suvaida Military Council is a military group of the Druze that is affiliated with al-Hishri and is mostly following his orders. berbers. They have started to attack the Bedouins at that point, and that included attacks against civilians. Houses of Bedouin civilians were torched by the Druze at this point. There were numerous reports about cruelties against Druze by the Bedouins, but also crimes through the Druze now committed against the Bedouins. According to reports, men were killed, women and children were displaced, as well as wide-scale looting was happening at that point. The crimes against the Bedouin civilians was in part been taken on video. There are videos showing how Bedouins were killed by the Druze, as there are videos of Druze civilians being killed by the Bedouins and by the government forces. The videos are also showing Druze fighters that are having Bedouin fighters, Bedouin men on the hoods of their motorcycles, driving around, basically parading the corpses of those that have killed. There is also pictures like this popping up where we see a Druze fighter visible here by his flag, who is standing next to a killed man hanging upside down on a gate here. The fighting was continuing, and the extent at that point became so big that other Druze leaders were demanding that the Bedouins that were taken prisoner by the Druze in Soveda are to be released. This example is Viam Wahab, who is a Lebanese Druze. He's pro-Hezbollah and generally a supporter of al-Hishri. So he is generally affiliated with the main force inside of Soveda that was involved in the clashes, but even he demanded that the Bedouins are to be released. Then, after these pictures appeared and after the reports appeared that Bedouins are being killed in a bigger degree, Bedouins from all of Syria had mobilized to help their Bedouin brothers inside of Soveda. The report was that 1,000 civilians are being captured, are being held by the Druze, and the fighting then continues, and the Bedouins who came from all over the country and the 41 tribes that came to help said they mobilized to come to Soveda to liberate those Bedouins that are being taken captive. In total, roughly 50,000 fighters were gathering to attack and to fight the Druze in this, and this included massive human rights violations against the Druze as well. This video, for instance, shows the execution of an unarmed civilian according to the report, but even if he had a gun before, at this point he doesn't have it anymore and he's being killed. There are also videos of them being mocked. We see a video here of his beard being shaved. Those videos appeared at the same time. The beard is important for the religion of the Druze, and they did this to basically mock the Druze. Those forces, by Bedouin forces, and the tribal forces were doing these human rights violations against the Druze on the 17th. On the next day, Hikmat al-Hishri was demanding an international force to get involved. He was at the same time, interestingly enough, apparently also demanding from the government in Damascus to stop the fighting after his own forces had attacked the government forces just a few days prior. He now demanded them to come back to protect the Druze from the tribal forces. Israel was now also giving permission to Damascus to protect the area, to stop the fighting there, after Israel had basically before forced the governmental forces from Damascus out of the region with airstrikes. Now Israel was giving its permission for them to return into the area. On the 19th, the next day, there was a ceasefire by the government. They announced it. The Druze and the Bedouins were joining in, and governmental forces were being deployed to Soveda, but the fighting was continuing. On the 20th, there were also additional fighting. Fighting continued, but increasingly the ceasefire was holding. Then the report was from the local Bedouins that the Druze are holding 5,000 hostages. As said, those are the local Bedouins who claim that 5,000 civilians are being held hostage by the Druze. And on the 21st, thousands of them were allowed to leave the area on buses that were sent by the government to evacuate. The evacuated civilians were giving accounts according to which loads of civilians, among them children, were executed by the Druze. Obviously, we need to see this with source criticism. Whether or not every one of these details is true is impossible to decide from the distance, but it seems to be clear that both sides committed serious human rights violations and murders. We have here the claim, the amount of killed individuals being accounted for. Here, 182 civilians were killed by governmental forces. The 3 Bedouins were killed by the Druze, according to this report. This report is from the 19th, so before all of the fighting here even ended. Then there are other reports according to which 50 Bedouins were killed by the Druze, civilians, among the casualties. There are also pictures and videos seemingly proving this, but a lot of the pictures and videos were fakes, were recycled videos from previous fighting, from previous years, from different places. So the past few days it was quite difficult to actually identify to which degree the spread pictures and videos were accurate. In total, though, 93,000 have been displaced. This is the biggest displacement of civilians since the fall of Assad, and this is the second time of mass casualties and massive murder among civilians since the fall of Assad, after the mass slaughter in Latakia a few months ago. Now let's come to the parties involved. Israel has gotten involved to help the Druze. They were basically forced to it to a certain degree to make the Israeli Druze happy. Israel has a significant Druze minority in its country, which is highly loyal with the government, and loads of them are serving in the military. So those Druze there are a loyal part of Israel, and these Druze have a lot of family connections to the Druze inside of Syria. Often it's the aunt of somebody they married or something in this area. So they have actual family connections to the Druze in Syria, and they were pressuring the government to get involved. We have here, for instance, the mayor of a Druze town saying that officers and enlisted soldiers want to get involved inside of Syria with their equipment. Basically, the threat that Druze soldiers might desert to engage in the fighting inside of Syria to help their Syrian brothers. Also, the involvement of the Israelis obviously has led to consequences over that. It has stopped the governmental forces, but it was impossible for the Israelis. They were not capable to stop the Bedouins and the tribal forces. And at the same time, this made sure that the majority of the Syrians are now seeing parts of the Druze being directly in connection with Israel, which will discredit them in the long term. This is also going to make it much more hard for Syria to remain a united country or to become one again if the Druze are now being considered to be basically an Israeli puppet by parts of the society. This brings with it the risk of additional violence in the future, as this might create additional hate against the Druze, that they should be punished for working with the Israelis. But we also have to say they also weakened the central government, as it had to watch the deportation, the displacement of Sunnis in the region, of the Sunni Bedouins that basically now had to flee the regions from the Druze fighters, and the government had to sign off on it with the ceasefire they were forced into by the US and by Israel. This will also make it much more difficult for Israel to normalize its relations with Syria, but there is obviously, we have to talk about the accusation that this might be intentional by the Israeli government, as this will prevent a consolidation of the government inside of Damascus and allows Israel to set up a permanent sphere of influence in the south of Syria. If they manage to bind the Syrian Druze with them and keep the government out of this, Syria will remain weakened, will never get as strong again as it can be united, and Syria will thus be weakened in the long term, while Israel will always have a foot in the door inside of Syria. Now, Now let's come to the tribal forces. The tribal forces were coming in their thousands from all over the country to help the Bedouins fight the Druze. They said they came to help the Druze after the they said they came to help the Bedouins after they were attacked by the Druze. The tribal forces are, as the Bedouins, Sunnis, and they are allied with the government. Sky News was reporting every Druze house is being looted and destroyed. We see countless tribal fighters that leave the area, their vehicles filled up to the brim with looted goods. So the tribal forces mobilized tens of thousands of fighters. They committed human rights violations, including murders, and they committed arson against Druze property and looted it. Now let's come to the next person involved. We have Al-Hishri here. Al-Hishri is connected with the Suwaida Military Council. In it are previous regime officers, so from the Assad regime. He is one of the three Mashiach, I think something, Al-Aki. Those are the spiritual leaders of the Druze, but he's only representing a part of the Druze. He is not recognizing Damascus as the overlord of all of Syria, and he says that Damascus is committing ethnic cleansing. He was, throughout the majority of the civil war, he was loyal with Assad. In 2015, for instance, he was asking the Druze to work with Assad's forces. In 2018, after the appearance of the Islamic State, he was telling the Druze they should join the Syrian army. Only in 2020, when increasingly the economic situation got worse, and only then did he go into increasing opposition towards the government in Damascus over the topics of economy and corruption. There are some claims that he's a drug dealer, but not only is he never sentenced for it, which is obvious kind of though, I do not find any proof of it that is solid. Now, obviously, in a context like this, it is helpful to defame somebody, to spread defamations about somebody to make him less credible. There are some claims that he is a Zionist drug dealer, but I do not see any serious accusations of those that aren't out of his direct competition. For instance, Layth al-Balus. He is connected with the government in Damascus. He's a Druze as well and fairly isolated in Suwaida. He seems to be the main accuser who says Al-Hishri is a drug lord, but I do not see any proof. So while this might be defamation, at the same time, he probably had the influence. It gave him the opportunity to make income, especially as the Druze were at the border with Jordan, and thus it would allow them to smuggle Captagon out of the country. He was in a close connection with the Assad regime for a long time, so he had ample opportunity to enter drug smuggling. The only thing I can say, I do not see anything that convinces me that he actually was a drug lord. He might have been one, he might be one, but this is not something that I can sign off according to the sources I have found. I also checked Arabic texts about him, and even in the vast majority of them, I do not see them calling him a drug dealer. So this might just be a domestic, another Druze competition, an enemy of him in his own community that is trying to smear him this way. From what I understand, he wants maximum autonomy from Damascus. So far, he hasn't really asked for full liberty for creating his own state, even though he says that they cannot accept being ruled by Damascus. But he seems to be the most radical position among the Druze in southern Syria, basically demanding to be as free from the government as possible. Now, we're talking about the Druze the whole time, so let's talk about them as well. Religiously, they are a sect that that has its origin in the Shiite part of Islam, like Assad's Alawites in Latakia. They are generally skeptical towards the central government, as the HTS, when it ruled Idlib, had suppressed Druze and mistreated them inside of Idlib. But the Druze are by no ways a monolithic bloc that has no opposition, that are united. In part, there were active attempts to work together with the central government in Damascus. For instance, several Druze leaders, for instance, this here Sheikh Youssef Yarbu, asked to work together with Damascus. And even after the human rights violations had already happened, they were still saying we need to work with Damascus, we need to work with the Syrian government, we need to be and we need to remain united. Also, the men of dignity, they have nothing to do with al-Hishri, but they still kept fighting the Bedouins and the tribal forces, as well as then the government forces. They said they did it out of self-defense. Basically, other militias have joined al-Hishri once the fighting has started, as obviously their opponents didn't make any difference to whom the Druze in front of them supported. And the moment human rights violations began, the moment murder began, the other Druze militia joined the fighting and helped al-Hishri's forces to fight the others. This shouldn't be understood, though, that the fact that others joined in an hour of need, that this is a united front, that they are all working together. There are reports that Druze were executed by other Druze for supposedly being traitors, especially those that are being connected with Damascus, the part of the Druze factions that had talked previously with Damascus trying to find a solution. Now let's come to the central government, and here we have the report that the Druze were initially asking them to stop the fighting. The Reuters was reporting here on the 15th that the Druze spiritual leadership said in a written statement on Tuesday morning that it would allow Syrian forces to enter Suwaida city to stop the bloodshed, calling on armed groups to surrender their weapons and cooperate with incoming troops. So at least part of the Druze spiritual leadership wanted the government to come to separate the Bedouins and the Druze, but after that additional fighting were following, and there are reports that the Druze had then attacked those government forces that were previously asked to come. They led them into an ambush, killed several of them, and then killed those that surrendered, executed them when they were unarmed. It's likely that al-Hishri's troops did those killings while probably the other groups were asking the governmental forces to enter. So these are crimes that have been committed by parts of the Druze, but at the same time there were accusations too that the governmental forces had started to shoot at Druze civilians there as well. So yeah, governmental forces have definitely participated in violence against civilians of the Druze population. We have to acknowledge, though, that the Damascus government doesn't have full control over its own military. The evacuations of the Bedouins from Suwaida will likely lead to a permanent displacement, and now it's falling back on al-Shara. He has to tell his own people that he is responsible for ethnic cleansing in Suwaida if the Bedouins do not come back. He signed the ceasefire with the Druze and Israel, and thus this is allowing this deportation, the fleeing of the Bedouins, of the Sunnis inside of Suwaida, which then might lead to them permanently leaving this. In total, we have to say Syria is further away from an organized central state than it has been in a long time. It does not seem likely that the government is being able to consolidate further after this. This is going to be a serious problem for the Druze for the government inside of Damascus. In addition, we have we need to talk about how all of this was possible. Now, apart from obvious religious fervor and Islamists and orthodoxy that leads to hate against other sects, there are a lot of open bills that were never paid, basically in regards to a civil war that lasted over 10 years. There are groups among the Syrians who have basically not suffered under Assad, except for individuals disappearing through the intelligence agencies, but they were generally living fairly decent under Assad's rule, even during the civil war. And these groups are being considered as collaborators, as traitors by parts of the rebels that have finally overthrown the government, and the Druze in Suwaida are part of this. We already talked about al-Hishri's actions inside the Syrian civil war, where he asked the Druze to join the Syrian army, Assad's army. So this is creating hate, and the hate there continues. At the same time, the current government is failing to punish the perpetrators of the crime by the regime, still to a vast degree. Now, there are being reported arrests now and then, and a lot of extra legal killing is happening. If you follow the appropriate accounts, you basically read almost every day that a former regime officer was just killed by gunmen, but there is no proper prosecution that is publicly being done, that is done fairly, that is done publicly, and this leads to a lot of people being unsatisfied with their victory as the perpetrators are still running around. Obviously, it's some kind of finding a middle ground between just executing everyone who was involved with the old government and taking the time to do a proper investigation and then a proper and fair trial. But currently a significant part inside of the country is unhappy, from what I've read, that they do not see the trials, they do not see the consequences of the criminal acts that were done by the previous regime. All of this is happening in a country that for a full generation has only known war, violence and murder, and has lost all its inhibiting measures. So there are people that have grown up in ruins, that have grown up in death and desperation, with death and desperation around it, and they are now in a country where this is not solved and where guns are available everywhere, as obviously the civil war has led to a widespread availability of guns. This is adding to this is a weak control by the government that has to rely on alliances. Basically, the government is based on HTS that ruled Idlib, but Idlib was a small part. They are fairly disciplined, they were fairly well organized, but to run the country, al-Shara had to make alliances with other rebel groups all over the country, and they didn't simply accept his leadership and give themselves up, but he had to make alliances. And this means that he doesn't even have the full control over the area where he supposedly has the control yet. And parts of those alliances, the militias that were other rebel groups at that point, some of them were simply declared to now be part of the army. They received uniforms and the name of divisions. Their leader was declared to now be a brigadier general or something like this. But to call someone part of the regular armed forces does not mean they actually are, and they actually follow the commands according to the regular structures. The control, so that those units are part of the official government forces and that they wear the uniform, that they are led by an officer that was appointed by the Ministry of Defense, does not mean in any ways that the Ministry of Defense has actual control over them. But at the same time, we cannot say that this means the government does not have any responsibility due to the fact that they do not control their military in full. We have to say, if you put on the captain's hat, then you're responsible for the ship you're on. So if there were orders in secret to commit those massacres by the Ministry of Defense and they only said the opposite in public, or if the perpetrators did it out of their own initiative and the government did not actually support it, does only play a minor role in the overall. We have to say the current government is responsible. If they are running those armed forces, if they are running them under their own flag, then they have to take responsibility whether they gave the orders or not. Generally, researching for this turned out, as you can imagine, to be extremely difficult. Anyone you find writing about this is basically having his own interests. You have the Turks who want HTS to be successful because they have influence with them, and who want the Syrian National Army to be having a strong influence in the future, especially as those are even better controlled by the Turks. You have Kurdish commentators that want the central government to fail, as it would absorb Rojava and take away the chance of the Kurds to have their independently governed area. Israel wants Syria to be weakened and extend its sphere of influence. Previous Assad fans want to see al-Shara to fail, as this would basically rehabilitate their support for the butcher Assad. And this is not even in this is not even close to summarize all of those participants that are currently writing about it, making video about it, and thus shaping and influencing the public perception, especially in social media. It's extremely difficult because almost everyone writing something about it that you might find, for instance, on Twitter or on Telegram, all of those have massive interests in an informational warfare in this current environment. At the same time, obviously, minorities in Israel are afraid about the terroristic roots of al-Shara. There's no reason not to talk about it, that al-Shara was a part of Al-Qaeda in the past, and this is understandable, but in media there are also the geopolitical interests of other nations playing a role, be it Israel, be it Turkey, be it Qatar. For instance, a lot of prominent voices, when you research into their background, you see that they work at an institute that receives huge donations from Qatar, who want the central government, who want a strong Orthodox Sunni government and want support it. So this makes it extremely difficult to analyze the data and to get a fair overview where you actually go to the sources, where you actually go to the real deal of the informations. In total, in general, I also found prominent voices that are working at institutes that seem reasonable, that have their 100,000 followers or more. And when I researched into what they said, they simply gave informations that were far from the reality, that were far from what is currently happening on the ground. For instance, the Syrian Druze al-Bulus, who is one of the enemies of al-Hishri. He was said to be the leader of the Men of Dignity, and the Men of Dignity says he doesn't have anything to do with it since 2016. Still, prominent voices that are being listened to in context with Syria claimed that he's the leader of the Men of Dignity, while his influence, from everything I find, is no longer of big relevance inside of Suvaida. So if you look at the background, it's an extremely complex situation, and it's very easy for everyone reading about it, for everyone researching about it, to simply take what is according to its own prejudices, what is following the own expectations of the situation, and believe it. And at the same time, it's obviously extremely easy to say he's a Druze, he's an Assadist, he's working for Qatar, and thus whatever he says is worthless. In total, this manipulation happened to a degree that I've hardly ever seen before. This was the informational warfare in the past 1.5 weeks was massive, to a degree that was really impressive. And this allows, obviously, all sides to be influenced and to be led astray in a way that is dangerous. I've done my best to get to the source of everything that happens, but obviously I cannot guarantee that what I just said is 100% correct. I did my best to mention everything that I find, to be fair with the topic, to see that crimes were not just committed by one side, but at the same time say in which order the crimes were happening. If this is important to you, then it should be, to the best of my knowledge, correct what I just said. Anyways, this was it with this video. If you liked it, then please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you want to support this channel, then you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.